Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And if you can join me in welcoming our webcast viewers as well. My name is Andrew Graham. I'm president of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and it's my pleasure to be your host for lunch today. Viewers, thank you for joining us. At the club, we're really proud of our track record of bringing really top leaders from fields in business and politics and the media to our podium to share their insights with you. I think it is, always gratifying to see a crowd as large and accomplished as this one come out for a lunchtime speaker. I think, the internet has not disrupted the business model of having really thoughtful speakers share their thoughts with you at lunchtime, and you are all proof of that today. Let me take a moment to acknowledge the generous support of today's sponsors. First of all, from Borden Ladner Gervais, Rick Shaban. We also have thanks to DBRS, represented by Doug Turnbull, WSP Canada, represented by Terry Thomason, Bruce Power, represented by Simon Frechette, and the Provincial Building and Construction Trades Council of Ontario, represented by Patrick Dillon. Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I'm sure all of you're here today, you know Infrastructure Ontario well. As you may know, it has received the Government Agency of the Year award 3 years in a row, recognized by the UK-based publications Partnerships Bulletin and P3 Bulletin. Infrastructure Ontario's exemplary product leadership and delivery have been lauded. President and CEO Ehren Cory is here to share how the agency has evolved and where it's going, from its early days as a project delivery startup to its internationally recognized partnership approach. He and the IO team have led the tendering and construction oversight of all major provincial infrastructure projects, and their main goal is to deliver on time and on budget. Currently, Mr. Cory and his executive team collaborate with the public and private partners to build, manage, finance, and enhance the province's assets. We're really excited to hear how these partnerships are working to modernize Ontario's public infrastructure. Ehren's held the role of president and CEO since 2017. He's been with the agency for 7 years in a number of executive roles. Prior, he held senior leadership roles with McKinsey & Company. I'm personally fortunate to have known Ehren for many years, and I know him to be a smart, hardworking, and caring person. I think we're all very fortunate, all taxpayers in Ontario are fortunate to have Ehren and his team working on our behalf. Ehren, I'm really pleased to invite you to take the Canadian Club of Toronto's podium.
Thank you. Good. Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here, and thank you, Andrew, very much for inviting me. I know you're nearing the end of your run as the president, and I thank you for your service, because I think the club and what it does is an amazing thing, and congrats to you. I am privileged to have this opportunity. Thank you. It's a wonderful thing to think about the legacy of people who've been on this stage and held this podium, prime ministers and poet laureates, and the only thing you can think of if you're me is that they've made a horrible mistake in asking me, or I've made a horrible mistake in accepting. But one way or the other, I'm thrilled to be here. And I actually think that kind of self-deprecating humor that I just did, a very Canadian thing, and I'm going to try and change the tone of that today, because the truth is, I think in Infrastructure Ontario is one of many examples of situations where we have a homegrown success story that we fail to recognize. Andrew talked about the track record that our agency has, the recognition that it enjoys around the world. And ironically, while we're known that way outside our borders, it's in Ontario that we're maybe least known or least recognized. So enough with the self-deprecating humor. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the agency that we've built, the foundation for success that we have, and how we think we're well set up to handle some of the challenges of the future. Because make no mistake, the opportunity we have and also the challenges that we face in delivering and managing over the long term new infrastructure here in Ontario and across the country is a massive one. It makes a big difference ultimately in the economic and social viability of our country. So with that, let me start with a experiment. Okay, please raise, this is done without preparation, so it works. Please raise a hand if you have undertaken a home renovation project. Big or small? Wow. Okay, that's everyone. Keep your hand, no, keep your hands up, please, as part of the experiment. Okay, now, you're going to raise your second hand if it went perfectly. Now, I'm going to define perfect for you before we go further. I'm going to define perfect. Perfect means, number one, you set a scope for the project, and it didn't change one iota. So you decided to, you didn't later on have to cheap down and go to the different countertops or linoleum. You stayed exactly as is. Number two, you set a timeline for it, and it stuck to the exact timeline. It finished on time when you said it was going to. When the contractor first met with you and said, we'll be done in 12 weeks, it was. And number three, you never once revised the budget you set, had to write another check or pay any more money. Okay, 2 hands up. I can count them on my hands, how many 2 hands up, and you should find those people afterwards and get their tips. They know something that the rest of you don't. Now, I want to say that in Ontario, in the last 15 years, we've built infrastructure, social and civil. We have 65 of those that are completed construction into operation, another 50 or so that are in some stage of construction or procurement. And now, I will tell you that 19 out of 20 of those, 95% of those, have finished on or under the original budget. And 2/3 of them have finished on or before the original set schedule. And all of them were done without addendum or changes to scope or compromises on quality. So that's the track record. Imagine your home project multiplied by 1,000 in terms of size and complexity and then delivered that way. So my goal today is to tell you a little bit about how we've been able to do that. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of Infrastructure Ontario, who we are, why we were created, and sort of the basic principles under which we operate. Talk about the emerging challenges we face and the environment we find ourselves in now, because it clearly is a time of transition. There are some really big forces at work that make maintaining that track record even more difficult in the future, and I want to talk about what we're doing to position ourselves for that and how we're adapting. So, I said I'd start about who we are and how we got to where we are, so just a few words about that. Infrastructure Ontario as an agency was created over time. It was the amalgamation of a series of things the government was doing, but we were all put together in one agency about a decade ago. And in a snapshot, Andrew said we're very well known, but I'm not so sure, Andrew. In a snapshot, we do a few important things for the province. One, we act as the centralized source of project management expertise from procurement through construction when big new infrastructure is getting built in the province. Second, we help manage and oversee the existing legacy assets of the province. Think of the 1,500 buildings that the province owns and runs services out of every day, 130,000 acres of land. So we help oversee and manage that ongoing asset base. And the third thing we do is we lend money. We loan money to municipalities and other similar types of organizations to fund their infrastructure. So we play a role both in the building of new, the maintaining of existing, and supporting other colleagues, especially at the municipal level, in building their infrastructure. That's what we do. Now, why we exist. Go back to the turn of the century, which I was joking to someone earlier, it's a weird turn of phrase, isn't it? You think I mean 1900, but I don't, I mean 2000. The turn of the century, it's a while ago now. In Ontario, just like in almost every part of the developed world, we were stuck when it came to building infrastructure. And we were stuck for some very fundamental reasons. Governments around the world had proven incapable of building and delivering large infrastructure projects. Think of an energy project in your mind, a major road, a big dig somewhere. Those projects had an incredible legacy, and I don't mean that in the positive sense of the word legacy, of going multiples over time and over budget. And actually what had happened in many jurisdictions, Ontario was one of those, that essentially government had lost the faith of the public, had lost the license to deliver new infrastructure. At the same time, the public sector was doing a really poor job of managing the stuff we did have. It was really hard, you can imagine. I'm sure many of you experienced this in your daily life too. It's hard to make the ongoing investments in keeping an asset in high quality and productive. Governments around the world had a tendency to build stuff, enjoy that part, cut the ribbon, probably take a deep breath because they were 3 or 4 years late by the time this was happening, and then abandon the infrastructure and let it start to deteriorate. So there was this cycle going on, and we had reached a basic point of impasse. So it was in that context, in the 15 years ago or so, that we started this concept, and we aren't the only ones. The UK were really at the forefront of this. Australia has done a lot of it. Our colleagues in British Columbia have a great track record of it. And many others around the world continue to. But at that time, in the early 2000s, a number of jurisdictions realized that our traditional way of building and maintaining infrastructure just wasn't working. And it was in that context that Infrastructure Ontario was created. The idea was, how can we do this differently and better? And we came up with a set of principles that we try and apply to everything we do. From those early days, they continue on to today. And I just want to talk to you about those. So the first is that government needs to start thinking about how to make performance-based contracts with the private sector. So what do I mean by that? Your home renovation example, when you hired the person, did you hire them and say, I want you to deliver me a functioning kitchen. It needs to look and work in the following way. It has the following finishes. That's our contract. You're going to deliver that output. Don't come back later and tell me about material cost increases. You had to pay overtime, et cetera. A performance-based contract focuses on the outcome. It focuses on what you're actually buying as a service and let the private sector figure out how to deliver it. We take a performance-based approach to every contract we do, whether that's for the maintenance of our existing portfolio of assets or for the building of new. So that's the first principle. That was the first fundamental change that agencies like ours tried to institute or bring to public sector contracting. The second, we tried to bring a more effective thinking around the life cycle of an asset. It's really easy to get folks on the capital cost of building something. If you want to get it built well and maintained for the long term, as I said, the best way to do that is to sign a contract that has incentives for the person who's designing it and building it to have a whole life cycle view. That's true about the energy usage of the asset. It's true about the cost to maintain it and fix major components in it. So as much as possible, we try and take that life cycle view of assets. We build for best value, not for lowest cost. So if someone's bidding to win one of our projects, typically what they're bidding is not just, they're bidding an NPV. They're bidding to build and maintain the asset over the long term. And we do that to give them all of the incentives to design and construct for the long term. Third principle, really fundamental to both of the first two things I said, we've got to have a really, really clear understanding of and sharing of risk between the public and the private sector. Risk is a funny word, and risk transfer, all we focus on, this is a non-ideological thing, but what we focus on is risk should always be borne by the person best suited to carry them. There are some risks that as government we're best to keep, and we would pay an incredible premium if we ever tried to push those onto the private sector. But there are a bunch of risks, actually, that they're way better positioned to manage. And so our job is in doing those performance-based contracts to be really smart about what are the risks that government is best to keep and maintain, and what are the risks that the private sector actually is better suited to bear. And how do we create a contract that shares those effectively? So all sorts of our time and energy is spent figuring out which risks are we best to keep, which risks are we best to transfer. Fourth, we needed to get much better at doing upfront due diligence and planning. We have expressions for this in IO. One of them is measure twice, cut once. One of them is go slow to go fast. What we mean by both of those is it's not about getting out the door fast, and we have to work really hard with our partners in the public sector to remind them success isn't announcing the project earlier, success is finishing the project as early as possible. It's about the ultimate delivery that matters, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about what's the due diligence. If you want to transfer risk, go back to my last point, if we want to transfer risk, the best way to do that is to at least understand them really clearly first. So if that means we need to do a little extra due diligence, understand the geotechnical and soil conditions, and understand the baseline conditions of an asset before we enter into a contract, that's much better. And again, I go back to your home building example, and I wonder whether when you started your reno project, you knew everything you needed to before entering into that initial contract with your contractor. So that idea of due diligence and planning became central to what we do. And the last thing, and I'll talk about how this is changing, but right from the start was this idea that we had to find new ways to bring innovation into the way we build things. And how do you get the most innovation that drives value for money? A big part of that is by competition and by having bidders actually competing against each other to come up with the best ideas. And again, if you think back to my very first point, if you're going to do a performance-based contract that says, I'm not buying from you 7 tons of concrete and 4 tons of gravel and this much, but I'm buying an outcome, an asset I can use, then the best way to do that is to say, now you figure out how you're going to design it and how you're going to build it. So that idea of creating an incentive for the private sector to innovate was the sixth kind of basic principle. So we started in the early 2000s to solve a problem. The problem was that we were stuck as a jurisdiction, and many jurisdictions like us were. Things weren't getting built, and we had essentially lost public faith. Fast forward to today, and through the principles I've described, these ideas of performance-based contracting with effective risk management, with a life cycle view of assets, good diligence and planning, and driving innovation, getting the private sector to find solutions to our problems, we've come a long way. And I talked about the track record that we have, and really if you look around the world at mega capital projects, it is quite unprecedented. And as I said, we have now built and put into operation 66 projects, hospitals, colleges, courts, jails, highways, and transit projects across the province, and we continue to do many more. Today, we really now manage a diverse portfolio of stuff brand new that we've just built and stuff that's 50 years old, and we do it all with those same principles. And we're constantly trying to find ways to keep our assets safe and productive and efficient. We've also built something here in Ontario that we should be really proud of. We've built an industry, and there's many of you in this room today. It's a pleasure to get to see so many familiar faces because we've built something here that also is world-renowned. That is an industry of designers, architects, and engineers, construction companies, investors from around our neighborhood and from around the world who have come to Ontario to do business. We've built an agency that I'm really proud to lead, and I have a number of my colleagues and teammates are in the room today, but we've attracted talent who have a shared sense of purpose, who come to work in the public sector to deliver outcomes and deliver public good, but with a private sector lens. And we've attracted an incredible breed of people who have a shared sense of purpose that we're doing something in support of our province, and we're bringing the best of what we've learned from the private sector to do that. And the third thing we've got that we should be really proud of is we've built a market. We've built a common approach. We have a set of bidding documents and an evaluation process that's withstood all sorts of tests and rigor and had lots of external scrutiny and really stands the test of time. And as I say, it's the envy of and the interest of many places around the world to understand how we've done that. We've introduced things like having a fairness monitor in all our procurements. So there's a whole industry that's grown around adjudicating the fairness of our process, making sure our procurements are run really well. That's an incredible thing, and it's something that many jurisdictions do come and learn from us. So we should be proud of that. But now let me talk about looking forward, because as I said, the challenges only get bigger, and we would be not following our own code, our own ethic, or our own reason for being if we were to rest on our laurels. And as we always say at our organization, we need to be proud but not satisfied. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in now. We're proud of how far we've come and the work we've done, but we're also far from satisfied. And when we look at the challenges we face and the challenges that governments at all levels face in making major new investments in transit and social infrastructure, we know we need to do more. For those in the room who are from our industry, you know that every year or two we publish a pipeline of the upcoming work that's coming. And I can tell you we're working on that now with government, and the amount of work, the scale of what we're doing continues to be really high. So we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to you all to keep thinking about how do we get even better. Now, as we do that, there are a couple of challenges that are in our mind that I'll just share with you. The first is just the scale of projects. Projects are getting bigger. That's a natural function just of the stuff we're building, first and foremost. Transit systems, by their very nature, are systems. That's why they have that word in them, I guess. Transit systems have to work in an integrated way. And one of the failures, if you listened earlier to my whole life cycle thinking, one of the worst things government can do is buy a vehicle from you and a signaling system from you and some track from you and try and put those together. That is what we're explicitly not very good at doing. And so systems like that come in an integrated fashion. That means they're big. It means you need to be working at a different scale. We need to be attracting people from other parts of the world. But that size in and of itself creates a new challenge for us relative to what we've been doing for the last 15 years. Second challenge. Technology is playing an incredibly different role in what we build. And I've been at I/O for 6.5 years or something like that. But even in my time, the change has been unbelievable. And what we used to think of as hospitals, we thought of them as kind of bricks and mortar projects, right? You build a hospital, you're building a bunch of rooms. Hospitals are incredibly technologically complex assets with systems that need to talk to each other in the building and in the way patient care is delivered. And the new hospitals we're building now really try and integrate the built environment with the patient service. And we have this example, I hear it from one of my clients, and I love this story. One of the newest hospitals we're building, the team has worked on a whole bunch of care scenarios. So a patient goes into cardiac arrest, for instance. What does the building need to do to respond? And it's things like being able to geolocate within the building who are the first responders who need to come, and paging them and knowing their location. Having elevators go to their floor to pick them up. Doors open so that they don't need to badge through them. Crash carts identified with RFID tags and brought to the room. Bed that the patient's in lowered to the right level if their crash cart, if they have to be zapped, you can tell I'm not a doctor, that the bed has been pre-lowered to the right height so that when everyone arrives in the room, the care happens urgently. That has to do with how we build the asset and create the technological environment. And that is very different than what some of our industry has been doing and what we've been doing. So that's a big challenge and something we have to think very differently about. The third thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about is how our infrastructure affects communities and affects our stakeholders in new and different ways. Certainly as you build transit, there's a whole nother level of public interaction. You're not going behind hoarding and saying, we'll let you know in 3 years when the project is done and we'll take the hoarding down and voila. You're building right through hearts of communities. And that has all sorts of implications for the way we interact in our environment. And the fourth thing is this, I mentioned earlier the principle of life cycle thinking and thinking for the long term. Well, that's changing too. There are new things we have to think about. The sustainability of the assets we build, its resiliency to climate change, the way it uses energy is becoming ever more important and something we need to price into our projects. There's a whole bunch of externalities that we're trying to think, how do we make sure that our projects reflect those? So those are the challenges we face, and it's really forced us to really adapt our vision of the agency we are and what we need to be. And as a team, we've spent a lot of time talking about how do we continue to adapt to that environment, and how do we focus on our vision, which is to build partnerships across the public and private sector to modernize Ontario's public assets. How do we become more than just a really good procurement agency and take on that bigger challenge of delivering and maintaining infrastructure in a changing world? So I want to just close by telling you about some of the things we're doing right now to adapt to that world. One, I talked earlier about a tenet of ours being around innovation and getting private sector innovation. Well, that is going to have to be redoubled in our efforts over the coming years. The Minister of Infrastructure, who I report to, interestingly, I report to a private board, non-political people, come from the business world, and that board in turn reports to the Minister of Infrastructure. And the Minister of Infrastructure, Minister McNaughton, has been very clear on this idea of innovation and how we need to be tapping into the market. And he recently, in March, announced some changes to this effect. How do we do a better job of recognizing in our procurement and making the door as open as possible? So I give you an example. Right now we're working with Metrolinx on one of their signature projects around the GO expansion. How do you increase the frequency of GO service all over the GTA and run trains rapidly all the way every day? We could say to somebody that we need to add this much track on Lakeshare West and we need to buy 200 more vehicles. We're not going that way. We're trying to really open up innovation in a new way by saying, here are how many people we think need to move between A and B. Please give us a bid that tells you how you're going to do that. Your choice on technology, your choice on how much to invest in upfront capital versus the ongoing operations. And in fact, we predict that more of the value of the bids will be in the 30 years of operation than in the capital cost. Bidders are all going to have their own strategies of what kind of vehicle choices they make, where they build track, all of the above. And so we're trying to change our aperture and open it up to new levels of innovation. And that's, in doing that, we have to get creative. So the best way to think of it is this. How much value will we assign to a bidder in that process I just described, who tells us they can reduce transit times from Oakville to Toronto on every journey by 4 minutes? How do you value that relative to the person who says they can build it for us for $100 million less? That's what we have to do If we say we want innovation, we actually have to learn how to value those things in a smart way and score our bids in a way that puts innovation at the front and puts value on things like better solutions that improve journey times. Second evolution we need to make is to move beyond risk transfer, which I described as so core to us, and it is, but into a more nuanced view of risk management. Because the best way to manage risk is not to figure out, I take it, no, you take it, and to pass it back and forth across the table. The best way is to just reduce it. We're doing things now in a very different way around identifying risks early in a project and saying, which of these, instead of debating should we take them or the private sector, which can we get ahead of and take out of the way? That could be from a permitting perspective, working with our municipal partners, because that's often a source of risk. Utilities, and a big risk in transit projects is getting all the utilities that are under the streetscape out of the way or moved ahead of time. So we're doing a lot more work now on risk identifying which of those we can get ahead of and move. Then we don't have to get into this tit-for-tat discussion of risk transfer if we take them out of the way in the first place. That's working to us to great effect in some of our transit projects and something we know we need to do more of. The third adaptation, I mentioned that the challenge we face is around engaging communities. So we're thinking a lot about how do we make residents and local business engaged every step of the way in our projects, both in the construction phase and in the ongoing operation of the asset. So we're doing things, baby steps. We're doing things like holding job fairs in local communities to try and introduce people to the projects that are in their neighborhoods. We're doing meetup events to allow local businesses who might have a chance to supply to the project to meet. Then there's a larger scale version of that where we as an industry, and I don't just, this is us, this is working with our government colleagues and with all of you in this room, figuring out how we're going to meet the longer term needs that we have. Talent shortages that we have in skilled trades, for instance, is one that all of us need to be concerned about. And we're really starting to think about what role we need to play in that, because it's not going to be enough for us to sit back and wait and hope for the talent to show up to deliver the scale of projects we want. The fourth thing that we're doing to adapt is thinking about our own talent and skills and what kind of place we need to be. About 3/4 of the people at Infrastructure Ontario, I mentioned the team we've built, and we've attracted people, about 3/4 come from the private sector or with some private sector experience. And what we've done is build this team that can merge common sense abilities from the private sector with policy thinking and our colleagues in ministries who are actually the owners of these assets, and for us to act as the bridge. But we've got to continue to attract and keep the right people. And if you think of our organization, we have investment bankers and lawyers and engineers and project managers and environmental specialists and heritage and archaeology specialists. That's the diverse mix of people we need to have to be able to deliver on the challenges we face. And we have to keep finding people who are interested in making public service part of their profile, but also bring that kind of deep sense of expertise. So that's a huge part of our adaptation. Fifth is around leveraging data in new ways. And we are so early in this. The building industry as a whole, the construction and building services industry, is pretty nascent in the way that it manages and uses data. We're looking at all sorts of ways in our procurements to look at data and trends, in the way we budget and to set up projects in the first place, and in the way we manage our buildings and getting smarter building systems, more predictive tools that help us manage our assets in new and better ways. We've had a real ethos around tracking our own results. We publish something called our track record report every year. That's how I can quote that 60 of our 66 projects, 95 have been on budget. We keep publishing that and similar documents because we're trying to put as much as possible into the public domain around how we work and what we do. But there's a lot more we can do with using data to be more predictive, and that's a big focus of our organization. And then last but not least, we're focused on how do we take our partnerships to a new level. And all that we do is done in partnership. We talk all the time about P3s, and P3 stands for public-private partnership. People often forget the third P, and they're partnerships governed by an incredibly dense and rich contract. And that feels for some people almost like a contradiction, but it's not. And what we have to do is get much better and more sophisticated in the way we keep working with our partners in the public sector, who have a policy goal and an asset they need built, and our partners in the private sector who deliver and manage our buildings for us on a daily basis. And that sense of partnership has to be core to what we do, and it's something that we keep every day trying to reinforce and figure out how do we improve the principles of partnership and leverage those to deliver on and continue on the track record of success we've had over the last 15 years. So I'm going to end just by showing you a very short video on that last point about partnership. It's interesting for me to talk in the abstract about building schools and hospitals and highways, but it's interesting to hear in a different voice to hear from one of our partners. This is the CEO of a hospital, Michelle Emanuele, and Michelle is the CEO of Trillium, someone we've done a lot of work with, a series of projects, and there's more to come. If you know anything of Trillium and their patient base, there's a ton of growth, and so we continue to work very closely together. And I'm going to share some of her thoughts on the relationship we have and what it means to work as partners.
Certainly with IO, that has been probably our most important partnership as it relates to building capacity. It comes to mind at least 3 important projects. Those projects would not have happened without a partnership with IO in the speed in which they happened, in the quality of the build that occurred, and also in the makeup and the complexion it brought to our community from an aesthetics perspective. You know, this is a beautiful atrium. This was really born out of the concept of healing and hope. If I think of the J-Wing and the innovation that occurred with IO at our side in how we were able to create more bed spaces in a very limited amount of space. And so that partnership really has been at, I would say, the root of faster capability to build capacity and to do so in a high quality way. When I think about partnership in IO, we're really bringing in an expertise and tried skills that we don't have. We don't build every day. We don't construct and design and project manage in that way every single day in the way IO does. And so we brought an expert, we brought a specialist to that partnership, and that was you. And that always makes us stronger and better. And I think I can certainly say in our partnership there was also a shared set of values. The importance of these projects are not just buildings. They're really about servicing a community, and I think IO understood that. When you've got a trusted partnership, when you have a partnership that's come through some tough times, that's a partnership that's strong, and that gives you strength to do things you didn't think you could have done in the past, in the future.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. So I want to end where I started and just summarize by saying over the last 15 years, we have built something here in Ontario that everyone in this room should be really proud of. As the CEO of this wonderful little agency, I certainly am. We're recognized around the world. We have delegations that come from US states and countries all over the world, and they visit to ask, how have we built what we have? How have we built the track record of success that we have, and how can we learn from you? And actually, the government has recently announced intention to pursue, or at least look at, ways that we can play a role outside of our borders in helping other jurisdictions learn from us and leverage the insight and the intellectual property we've built over the last 15 years to their benefit. And what we think is that doing so will do 2 things. It'll help those jurisdictions and help address the infrastructure shortage that the world faces. And it also, we hope, will create a real anchor and an opportunity for Ontario-based companies to be able to participate in other markets because they have a homegrown advantage having spent the last decade plus working here. We have this incredible base to work from, and we have an opportunity in front of us. We face real interesting challenges in how we can continue to deliver meaningful social infrastructure and transit and civil infrastructure in ways to the benefit of taxpayers, to the benefit of citizens Ontario. If we get it right, it sets us up in a way that makes us the envy of other jurisdictions, because infrastructure really is at the heart of vibrant communities. We are excited about that challenge. We know that there's lots of work to do, and we look forward to working with all of you here to do it in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Ehren, thank you very much for those remarks. We've got a bit of time for some questions. We've had quite a few questions from the audience.
Great.
So we'll get into those.
Do I get to pre-screen them or no?
No, you don't.
Okay. Okay.
We'll have the hardest ones. We'll make sure the hardest ones get answered. So first of all, there's been talk of international work or potential international work by Infrastructure Ontario. Can you talk more about that? Does that mean that the success that you've had here, you're going to be taking to clients elsewhere? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I was mentioning it just at the end. Thank you. So we have been, over our entire history, Andrew, getting ad hoc requests. We track them, and I don't know how many we're up to, over 50 jurisdictions. The state of Kentucky, the country of Ghana, and everyone in between, who come looking, and other provinces, municipalities here in Ontario, who face the same challenge we did. We have a big infrastructure project. We haven't built anything in a long time. Can you help? And what they're really looking for is not help building the thing that they have. It's more foundational. How do we set up an agency like yours? How do we create the rule of law? Sometimes they're asking. How do we create documents and templates that make sense? And so earlier this year, the government announced an intention to at least pilot or test the waters of whether we could be providing that service, essentially on a fee basis, taking what we've learned and having other jurisdictions come and learn from us. And I think it's a mix of us having them come here and learn from us, and us going there and doing some teaching. It's really about taking the built-up intellectual capital that we have over our last 15 or 20 years and sharing it. It's something that I think, obviously, we have to balance against the incredible pipeline of stuff we have to get done right here. And our eye can't come off the ball, and it never will. But this is about how do we take all the good stuff we built and leverage it. And so what we're working with the government right now is, what does a pilot of that look like? Do we do it in a few jurisdictions? And if so, where? To sort of test whether there's a market for this and whether it's something that creates real value. And as I said, part of the thesis is that it creates value not just for those jurisdictions, but for the Ontario and Canadian-based companies who understand how to work in a P3 environment.
So we're not going to see IO building a highway in Ghana in the near future?
No, definitely not.
You've talked about the rule of law and democracy. How do you think about the interplay between a project that might take 10 or 15 years to go from conception to build, and the fact that governments last much shorter times than that and may have different priorities? How does, in any jurisdiction, what's the right way to think about that?
Well, we're lucky in Canada, and especially here in Ontario, that we have gotten past the debate of whether we need to reinvest in infrastructure. I don't think it's a political issue in the sense that where one party says yes and one says no, or it's actually not a debate. We went through, if you look at there's some great graphs on this. If you looked at investment in infrastructure to GDP from World War II to today, it looks incredible for 20 years or so post-war, and then it goes into a bathtub like you wouldn't believe from, say, the early 70s till 2000. And since then, at different paces in different jurisdictions, that's ramped back up. In Ontario, we've had the privilege of we're ahead of the curve in the reinvestment we've made. But that's because all of us know that after a generation of not investing in energy infrastructure, transit infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, we had really critical bottlenecks in each of those things. So the debate has shifted past should we or not, and it's only now about how best to do it. To answer your question, I mean, interestingly, we had an election in both the province and the city of Toronto, which affects us in some indirect way last year. Look around the province, we're still building lots of infrastructure. The government that came in Ontario, our new government, has done a really good job of revisiting what their priorities are. So they've taken a particular lens around transit and around ending hallway medicine and said, okay, how do we direct our investment to those? But there hasn't been, what you used to see, I think, is you'd see come right to a stop, and then a few years later, the engine would start back up, and it just hasn't felt that way in our current environment.
Very specific question. You usually have an annual update of projects in your planning pipeline by now. Can you give us a hint of when we'll see that? I think you mentioned that earlier in your speech, but someone's very interested.
So I joked to someone that actually it should be like at a Raptors game and have a ceiling drop where they fall out. It would be awesome if I could do that, but I can't. I couldn't arrange it. No, we do. So just for context, what we've done, and it is one of the keys to our success. I didn't mention it, but it's been a real part of our program from the outset. Has been every year to 18 months to publish a pipeline of the upcoming projects that the government has approved, and some sense of the timing of when they're coming out and their scale. And we do that. It's not a big show. It's not a political announcement. It's for the industry. And the reason we do it is to help people, and I know why the question comes, because that's why people are asking. It's to help industry plan their resources, figure out what they're going to bid on, who do they need to partner with to deliver. And so they want a team, and they want to set their money, plan their bidding schedule accordingly. That's why we do it. Obviously, with the new government, who's been in power, I guess, just under a year, they had to start by, as I said, setting their infrastructure priorities, and we've been working with them to take those priorities and turn those into an update to the pipeline. The answer is, I came from a meeting today where we were looking at that draft of that and how do we move it forward, and in the coming months, there'll be one. In the meantime, what I say really proudly is we have continued on pace on a lot of the big initiatives we had underway on the transit side and on our hospital projects in particular. So there hasn't been this big lull, but the pipeline will come out sometime soon.
Great. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
You know, it's such a pleasure hearing about success stories. It's too easy to focus on things that are going wrong, but I think we're having a moment in Toronto right now about success stories, right? So it's great to hear. You mentioned the Raptors. It's great to hear about another one. So Ehren, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and speak to all of us and teach us a little bit. Certainly in my case, teach me a little bit about what Infrastructure Ontario does. I think there were so many hands in the air earlier. Who wishes that Infrastructure Ontario could take over their next renovation or home build? I don't know if that would be as lucrative as advising other governments, but I think there's a lot of people around the room who would love for you to take that on. That would actually be a great service that I think would build a lot of political capital for Infrastructure Ontario. In all seriousness, what you do is really, really important. What your agency does is very important and impacts everyone in Ontario. So thank you so much, Ehren, for what you and your team do and for coming in front of the Canadian Club audience today and sharing so much of it. So thank you very much. Just before we conclude, I'll tell you about a few upcoming events that we're very excited about. First of all, next Tuesday on June 4th, we are very proud to be presenting our 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award to the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. I think that's going to be a fascinating and engaging conversation. There's still some tickets left for that. I think it's going to be really a terrific event. And on Wednesday, June 5th, we have the editor-in-chief of The Advocate, America's oldest LGBT magazine, Zach Stafford, who will be at our podium. Both of those events, I think, are going to be really exciting. We hope you can attend them. And just in closing, I want to extend another round of thanks to today's event sponsors, BLG, DBRS, WSP, Bruce Power, and the Provincial Building and Construction Trade Council of Ontario. Thank you. And thanks also to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. And finally, a big thank you to all of you for attending. Hope to see you again soon.